Libra, something intense shifted this morning. Someone connected to you is overwhelmed with emotion and can't seem to stop thinking about you. The cards have a powerful message you need to hear today. Before we go anywhere else in this reading, I need you to understand exactly what I mean when I say he has been shaking since this morning. I am not talking about a bad mood. I am not talking about someone who is a little quiet today, a little distracted, a little off his rhythm, the way any of us get sometimes for reasons that don't mean much of anything. I am talking about a physical event happening inside another human being's body right now, today, because of what is happening between the two of you. Somewhere in some room you may or may not be able to picture, in a car, at a desk, on the edge of a bed he hasn't fully gotten out of, he is sitting with his hands not quite steady, his chest tight in the way he cannot talk himself out of, his whole nervous system responding to something too large for his mind to manage on its own. This is not a metaphor. This is not me being dramatic to hook you into a reading. And I want to say that plainly because I know how these titles can look. And I know some of you click on them expecting exaggeration. This is what is coming through, clearly, specifically, and undeniably. And I want you to take it seriously before we go one card further. For some of you, this is going to land as confirmation of something you already half knew, a suspicion you've been sitting with quietly for weeks, maybe longer, that there was more happening underneath the surface than what you were being shown. For others, this is going to feel like a complete reversal of the story you've been telling yourself about where you stand with him. A story that maybe involved convincing yourself he simply isn't that invested, that you've been the one carrying more weight in this connection, that the imbalance you felt is just the shape of who he is. I want you to hold both possibilities loosely as we go through this, because the cards don't care which story you walked in with. They only care about what's true. And what's coming through today is going to ask you to set down whatever version of him you've been protecting yourself with, and look instead at something closer to the whole picture. Take a breath in, all the way down, and let it out slowly. Because what this reading is going to ask of you is not to brace for something difficult. It is to expand your understanding of someone who clearly matters to you, whether you've said that out loud to anyone or not. Maybe not even to yourself. And expansion requires openness, not tension. So however you're watching this, on a break, in bed, at your desk pretending to work, in the car before you go inside somewhere, I want you actually present for this one, not half listening while you scroll something else. This is not a reading to have on in the background. I also want to acknowledge something before we begin, because I think it matters for how you receive everything that follows. Some of you arrived at this video already deep in the middle of a specific situation, a specific person, a specific unresolved thread that's been sitting in your chest for weeks or months now. Others of you clicked on this not entirely sure who it's even about yet, maybe holding 2 or 3 possibilities in your mind at once, unsure which connection this energy is actually describing. I want you to know that both of those starting points are completely fine. The cards don't need you to arrive with certainty about who this is. They only need you to stay open as the picture forms, and trust that if this is about someone specific for you, you will know it in your body well before I finish naming all 12 cards. That recognition, when it comes, tends to arrive as a kind of quiet, unmistakable click. Not a dramatic bolt of lightning, but something closer to a puzzle piece sliding into a place it always belonged. I want to name the spread I'm pulling for you today because the structure of it matters, and I chose it specifically for this situation. I'm calling this the Shaking Ground spread. 12 cards, built to walk through what actually happened this morning, why it happened now and not before, what it's revealing about who he actually is underneath what you've been shown, what it has cost the two of you to get here, and where all of this is realistically heading. 12 cards are a lot, and I am not going to rush a single one of them, because every position in this spread is going to add a piece to a picture that I don't think you've had full access to until now. So settle in. This is a long one, and it needs to be, because what's underneath this situation is not something that fits into a quick 5-minute answer. Let's begin with the first position, which I'm calling the trigger, because I want to understand exactly what happened this morning before we go anywhere else in the spread. The card that comes up here is the Eight of Swords. And for anyone who knows this card, you know it's a card of self-imposed restriction, a figure bound and blindfolded, surrounded by swords that look like a cage, but are actually loose enough to step out of if the person could only see clearly enough to try. This is exactly what I'm sensing happened to him this morning. Something small, something that might look completely unremarkable from the outside, cracked the blindfold he's been wearing for longer than either of you would probably guess. For some of you, it was something specific, a notification, a name on a screen he wasn't expecting to see, a memory surfacing uninvited while he was doing something as ordinary as making coffee or driving to work with the radio on. For others, there wasn't an external trigger at all. It was internal, a thought that arrived on its own, the way they sometimes do in the quiet moments right after waking, before the noise of the day has had a chance to drown it out and give him something else to focus on. Whatever the specific shape of it was, the effect was the same. Something he had been managing to keep at a manageable distance suddenly wasn't at a distance anymore. It was right there, close enough to touch, close enough that pretending it wasn't real stopped being an option his mind could offer him. And once that happens, once the blindfold slips even slightly, you cannot fully put it back the way it was. That's what this morning actually was. Not the beginning of the feeling itself, because the feeling has clearly been there for a long time. The beginning of him no longer being able to pretend the feeling wasn't as large as it actually is. The second position is what's physically happening in him right now. And here I'm pulling the Nine of Swords, which is one of the more intense cards in this deck, to see land in this position. A figure sitting upright in the middle of the night, hands over their face, surrounded by images of anguish hovering just above them. This card is about the body carrying what the mind cannot process quickly enough, and that is precisely what's happening to him. The shaking you've heard about, or sensed, or maybe haven't even been told about directly yet, but are somehow already sensing, is real. Is his nervous system doing exactly what a nervous system is built to do when the emotional load exceeds what a person can hold quietly and privately, the way he's used to holding things? This is not weakness. I want to say that clearly because there's a real chance that some part of you, somewhere, has spent time thinking of him as someone who simply doesn't feel as much as you do, someone more composed, someone less affected by all of this than you are, someone who has it together while you're the one lying awake overanalyzing. This card dismantles that story completely, and I want you to actually let it land rather than just hearing it and moving on. What's happening in his body right now is the opposite of not caring. It is caring at a volume he has genuinely never had to manage before. And his body, not his mind, not his carefully chosen words, not the version of himself he presents to you or to anyone else, his actual physical body is telling the truth that his mouth has not yet been able to tell you. For some of you watching, this might be the person who used to seem so unreadable, so contained, so careful, that you started to wonder if there was even anything underneath the surface at all. If maybe you'd been building a whole emotional world around someone who simply wasn't capable of matching it. There is something underneath. There has always been something underneath. What you're sensing now, in whatever fragments you've been sensing it, is real. And it did not come from nowhere. and it did not come from your imagination working overtime the way you might have convinced yourself it did on the harder nights. I want to pause here for just a moment before the next card, because I think it's worth sitting in this specific truth a little longer. So many of you watching this have spent real energy talking yourselves out of what you sensed, because talking yourself out of it felt safer than being wrong, safer than hoping for something that might not be there. I want you to notice right now whether that's a pattern in you, not just with him, but generally, a habit of doubting your own read on people because trusting it once cost you something. That's worth naming for yourself, even quietly, even just in your own head, before we move forward. There's something else I want to say here, because I think it's easy to hear a reading like this and immediately jump ahead to what it means for the relationship, what it means for your next move, whether you should text him or wait or say something. I want to slow that impulse down for a moment. Before this becomes about strategy, I want it to be about simply witnessing what's true. Somewhere, right now, a person who has spent a long time being careful with his own heart is having an experience he cannot manage his way out of. That is worth sitting with on its own, separate from what it means for you, before we move into the cards that will tell us what it means for the two of you together. Give yourself that moment. You don't have to know what to do with this information yet. You just have to let it be true first. Moving into the third position, which I'm calling the tragedy itself, because that word is doing real work in this reading, and I don't want to move past it too quickly or too lightly. The card here is the Ten of Swords, and yes, I know how that card looks when you first see it, a figure face down with 10 blades in their back. And I want to be precise about what it actually means in this position, because it is not predicting anything violent happening to anyone. It's a card about an ending or a reckoning that came from a specific, identifiable pattern finally reaching its natural conclusion. And it's a card about looking back with total clarity and seeing exactly how you got to where you are. Every wrong turn visible in hindsight, even though none of them felt like wrong turns in the moment they were made. The tragedy I'm sensing here is not one dramatic moment, one betrayal, one clear villain, and one clear victim. It is an accumulation, built slowly, quietly, over a long stretch of small decisions. Every time he felt something real and chose a safer, smaller response instead of the true one. Every time closeness was available and sitting right there, and he reached for distance because distance felt more survivable in the moment than the risk of being fully seen. Every message he composed in his head and never sent. Every conversation where the true thing was sitting right there in his chest, pressing against his ribs. And what actually came out of his mouth instead was something careful, something measured, something that protected him at the direct cost of the connection he says, or would say if you asked him, that he wants. That is the tragedy as I'm reading it. Not a single betrayal you could point to and say, there, that's where it broke. A slow accumulation of a person choosing fear over honesty, over and over. Small choice after small choice, until the total cost of all that choosing became too large to keep hiding from, even from himself. And this morning, for what I sense is genuinely the first time, he saw the whole pattern at once, instead of one small choice at a time. That kind of clarity is devastating precisely because it cannot be argued with or explained away the way individual moments can. He is not confused about what happened here. He knows exactly what he did and didn't do. And that knowing is sitting in his body right now as something closer to grief than regret. I want to be clear about something before we go further, because I don't want this reading to leave you carrying weight that was never yours to carry. This tragedy, everything I've just described, was built from his choices, not yours. Whatever role you've played in this dynamic, and every dynamic has two people shaping it, the specific pattern of choosing fear over honesty, of choosing containment when openness was needed, that pattern belongs to him. I'm not telling you this so you can feel angry at him. And I'm not telling you this so you can feel sorry for him either. I'm telling you because I think you deserve an accurate map of what's actually been happening, not a partial one, and not one that quietly makes this your responsibility to fix. I also want to name something about the specific quality of what he's feeling right now, because I don't think grief is a word most people would immediately reach for in a situation like this. And yet grief is exactly what's coming through. There is a particular kind of grief that shows up not when something has definitively ended, but when a person realizes how close they've come to losing something without ever having properly fought for it. It's a grief tangled up with regret, but sharper than ordinary regret, because it carries the specific sting of watching yourself do the thing you swore you wouldn't do. Again, one more time, until the pattern became the whole story instead of just one chapter in it. That's the flavor of what's moving through him this morning. Not simple sadness, something closer to mourning a version of this connection that could have existed by now if he had made different choices earlier. And the dawning awareness that he still might be able to reach it, but only if today is genuinely different from every other day he told himself he'd change and didn't. The fourth card, in the position I'm calling who he really is beneath what you've seen, brings up the moon. And this is one of the most important cards in this entire spread. So I want to slow all the way down here and really sit with it. The moon is about what exists beneath the surface of a person, the parts that don't show themselves in ordinary daylight, the emotional depths that only reveal themselves privately, at night, when no one is watching closely enough to judge the shape of them or use them as a weapon later. This card is confirming something I already sensed the moment I started shuffling for you, which is that the version of him you have been given day to day, the composed one, the harder to read one, the one who seems less invested than you clearly are, is not the actual depth of who he is. It's the version that felt safe enough to show. Underneath that surface is someone who feels things intensely, someone with feelings for you that are significant, quite possibly larger than anything he has shown another person in a long time, maybe ever, and who has been actively working, whether consciously or not, to keep that depth hidden, because showing it has always felt dangerous to him in some way that predates you entirely. For some of you, this is going to explain so much about the confusing gap between his words and his actions over however long this has gone on. Why the things he said never quite matched the way he looked at you when he thought you weren't paying attention. Why his behavior sometimes seemed to contradict itself in ways that made you feel like you were losing your grip on what was even real. That contradiction was never him being careless or unclear about what he wanted. It was him managing an internal experience so much bigger than what he was willing to let you see, that the two versions of him were always going to look mismatched from where you were standing. I want to pause here for a second before we go into the next few cards, because I think this is a good moment for you to drop into the comments and tell me if any of this is already resonating with what you've been living. Has there been a specific moment where you caught a glimpse of something more in him? Something that didn't match the story you'd built about who he is, or how much he cares? A look that lasted a beat too long, a reaction that gave away more than his words did. And then you talked yourself out of trusting what you saw, because it didn't fit with his behavior the rest of the time? I would genuinely love to read those in the comments, because I think a lot of people in this community are living inside exactly that gap right now. The gap between what you sense underneath and what you're actually shown on the surface. And there is something powerful about naming that gap out loud instead of carrying it alone in your own head. Let's continue into the fifth position, which I'm calling where this pattern came from, Because I don't think it's fair or accurate to describe his guardedness without also describing where it originated. The card here is the Hierophant reversed, which in this context is speaking to something learned early. Some kind of conditioning around what was safe to express emotionally and what wasn't. Possibly coming from an earlier relationship where full openness was met with harm rather than safety. Possibly coming from something further back than that. Family patterns from childhood, an early heartbreak that taught him a lesson he never fully unlearned. Whatever the exact source, and I'm not always given the precise details of a person's history in a reading like this, what it produced in him was a rule, mostly unconscious, running quietly underneath his behavior, that full visibility is dangerous. That the safest way to move through any connection that starts to matter is to keep something back, to never let anyone see the entire depth of what he feels. Because if they see the whole thing, they might use it against him later. Or they might leave anyway once they've seen it. And then he'd have been exposed for nothing. This is not a flaw in his character, not a moral failing you should hold against him, the way you might hold against someone who simply doesn't care. It's a wound wearing the costume of a personality trait, something that looks like coldness or detachment from the outside, but is actually closer to a scar tissue built around something that once got hurt very badly. For some of you, understanding this is going to soften something in you toward him. And if it does, I want you to allow that softening, rather than fighting it out of some sense that you shouldn't let him off the hook. For others, understanding the why is not going to erase the impact of the behavior on you, and that reaction is just as valid. Both things can be true at once. Where a pattern comes from explains it. It does not automatically excuse what it has cost you to be on the receiving end of it. The sixth card sits in the position of what he has been too afraid to say. And here I'm pulling the King of Cups reversed, a card about emotional mastery that has tipped over into emotional suppression. Someone genuinely capable of deep feeling, who has instead spent a long time managing that feeling from behind a wall of practiced composure. What I'm sensing wanting to come through here is something close to an admission he has rehearsed in his own head more times than you would believe. Sentences he has built and dismantled and rebuilt while lying awake or driving alone, and never once said out loud to you. Something like an honest account of how much you actually mean to him, stripped of the careful qualifiers he usually attaches to anything close to that admission. Something like an apology for the specific, particular ways his distance has hurt you over time. An apology he has known he has owed you for longer than he has been willing to offer it. Because offering it means admitting fault in a way that terrifies him. Something like a truth about where his head and heart actually were during the moments you experienced as cold or absent or confusing. Moments that were, from his side of things, some of the most intensely felt moments of the entire connection, even though absolutely nothing about his outward behavior in those moments would have told you that. He has been carrying an entire unspoken emotional reality that runs parallel to whatever he's actually shown you, like a second conversation happening underneath the one you can both hear. And that unspoken reality is what broke through this morning. What's shaking loose in him right now is not a new feeling suddenly arriving out of nowhere. It's an old, enormous, carefully hidden feeling, finally becoming too big and too heavy to keep hiding successfully anymore. I want to add something practical here because I think it will help you recognize this when it eventually arrives. When someone has been suppressing something this large for this long, the way it finally comes out rarely matches the polish of what he rehearsed in his head. It tends to arrive a little clumsy, a little too direct, sometimes at an odd hour, sometimes in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation, because the pressure behind it has built up past the point where it can wait for a perfectly staged moment. Don't mistake that clumsiness for insincerity. Often the opposite is true. The most rehearsed, most polished declarations are sometimes the least trustworthy, because they've been performed rather than felt in real time. What's coming from him is more likely to sound unfinished, a little raw around the edges, and that roughness is actually a good sign, not a red flag. 7th position, and this one is for you specifically. What you have sensed but couldn't confirm. The card is the Two of Cups, a card of mutual recognition, of a connection that genuinely runs both ways, even when it doesn't look symmetrical from the outside looking in. I want to say this plainly, and I want you to actually hear it rather than skim past it. Whatever quiet, private certainty you've had at different points along the way, that there was more there than what he was actively showing you, that his behavior simply didn't add up with what you could feel underneath it when you were close to him, that gut sense of yours was not wrong. You were not imagining a connection that didn't exist. You were not reading too much into small moments the way people around you might have suggested when you tried to explain the situation out loud. You were sensing something real, and then, understandably, given how confusing the outside evidence was, doubting yourself because what you felt didn't match what you were being shown. For some of you, this ongoing mismatch has caused you to question your own judgment far beyond this one situation. A general creeping sense of not trusting your own read on people or circumstances anymore, because this one felt so disorienting for so long. I want to be clear with you that your instincts here were accurate the entire time. The confusion you felt was never coming from a flaw in your perception or an overactive imagination. It was coming from a genuine mismatch between what he actually felt internally and what he was willing to let show externally. And that mismatch was never something you were going to be able to solve on your own by watching him more carefully or asking better questions, because the information you needed was being actively withheld from you, not simply poorly communicated by accident. The 8th card is about the cost to you, specifically, because I don't want this reading to become entirely about his internal experience without properly honoring what all of this has taken from you along the way. The card here is the 5 of Pentacles, a card of standing out in the cold, looking in through a window at warmth you can see but can't quite reach, carrying something genuinely difficult without adequate support from the person who should have been offering it. This connection, in whatever form it has taken for you, has had a real and measurable cost. And I don't want to gloss over it just because the rest of this reading is pointing somewhere more hopeful. The uncertainty of not knowing where you actually stood with him on any given day. The energy spent interpreting mixed signals, replaying conversations, trying to figure out what was genuine affection and what was just distance you were reading meaning into, and what any of it actually meant about how he truly felt underneath. The moments of quietly doubting your own worth, because the asymmetry in how openly each of you expressed things made it feel unfairly and inaccurately like you cared more than he did, like you were more invested than he was, like something about you specifically was too much, too intense, too eager for the amount he seemed willing to give back in return. I want to be honest with you here. That cost was real, and it deserves to be acknowledged clearly before we move any further into what's coming from him. Because whatever comes next, however genuine it eventually turns out to be, it does not automatically erase or make up for what this has already taken from you to arrive at this point. You are allowed to hold both the difficult truth of what you've lived through and the real potential of what might be coming, without letting the second thing quietly minimize or rush past the first. I want to add one more layer to this because I think it's easy to hear a card like this and only apply it to the big, obvious moments. The canceled plans, the unanswered messages, the times he pulled away right when you needed him close. But the cost of this kind of dynamic often lives in smaller, quieter places too. The way you've maybe started rehearsing what you say to him before you say it, editing yourself down to something that feels less risky to offer. The way you've possibly stopped mentioning certain feelings out loud because you got tired of watching them land somewhere that didn't quite know what to do with them. The small, private erosion of trusting that your full self is welcome in this connection, exactly as it is, without needing to be managed or measured first. That erosion is real, and it's worth naming, because healing it is going to matter just as much as whatever he eventually says to you, if not more. I want to pause again here, because this feels like the right place for it. If you're watching this, and some part of what I've just said hit close to home, the specific exhaustion of being the one who feels more openly, who shows up more visibly, while wondering if that makes you somehow too much, I want you to drop a word in the comments. Just a word. Tired, seen, exhausted, whatever fits. I read these, and I think there's real value in this community seeing how many of you are nodding along to the exact same experience right now. Ninth position, what's coming from him next? And the card that comes up is the Six of Swords, a card of moving away from turmoil toward calmer water, a transitional card. Someone in the process of leaving one version of themselves behind and moving, slowly, sometimes awkwardly, toward another. What I'm sensing here is that this morning was not the end point of what's happening in him. It was the beginning of a shift that is going to produce real movement, and specifically movement in your direction, not away from it. Not necessarily today, and probably not in the next few hours either, because the kind of internal reckoning he's experiencing right now usually needs some time to settle before it becomes something a person can genuinely act from, rather than just something they're raw reacting to in the immediate aftermath. But the momentum created by whatever cracked open in him this morning is real, and it is not going to simply fade back into the old familiar pattern, the way smaller moments of near honesty have quietly faded before, without ever turning into anything. Something about this particular reckoning is different, larger, harder to fully suppress and file away again, the way he might have managed with smaller realizations in the past. For some of you, what comes will look like a message, a specific reaching out that feels noticeably different in tone and depth than what you're used to receiving from him. For others, it may look less like words at first, and more like a shift in behavior, more presence, less of the careful management and emotional hedging you've grown used to over time. I would encourage you to watch for the quality of what comes, rather than waiting anxiously for one single, perfect, dramatic gesture that resolves everything at once. The shift is far more likely to show up gradually in how he actually shows up over the following days, than in one flawless sentence that fixes everything in a single conversation. The 10th card addresses timing specifically, because I know that's the part almost everyone watching this wants a clear, concrete answer on. And here I'm pulling the Wheel of Fortune, a card about cycles turning, about timing that is influenced by forces larger than simple willpower or intention, sometimes moving faster than a person expects, and sometimes considerably slower, but always, eventually, moving. What this tells me is that the exact day matters far less than the direction, and the direction, as I'm reading it, is already set in motion. For some of you, movement from him will come within the next few days, close enough on the heels of this morning that the two will feel clearly connected when you look back on it later. For others, there may be a longer gap before anything visible happens, a week or two of him quietly working through the discomfort of what he saw about himself this morning, before he feels able to act on it in a way that feels solid and considered, rather than impulsive and reactive. I want to gently discourage you from measuring the sincerity of what's coming by how quickly it arrives. A slower arrival does not automatically mean a smaller or less significant shift happened inside him. Sometimes the people who take the longest to say the true thing out loud are the ones for whom the true thing has actually landed the deepest, precisely because they need more time to make sure they can genuinely follow through on it, rather than offering something in the heat of an emotional moment, only to quietly retreat once the initial intensity fades, the way he may have done before. 11th position, how to meet what comes. And the card here is the Queen of Swords, a card of clear-eyed discernment, someone who can hold compassion and firm boundaries in the same hand, without one canceling out the other. This is the exact energy I want you to bring to whatever eventually arrives from him. Not closed off, not so guarded that you end up punishing him for finally showing up after everything, but not naive either. Not so relieved that he's finally said something real that you abandon your own needs entirely in the rush to accept whatever is offered. You are allowed to receive whatever comes with genuine warmth, while still asking clear, direct questions about what it actually means going forward. You are allowed to want more than a single moment of honesty after a long stretch of confusion and mixed signals. You are allowed to need to see this sustained over time, not just felt intensely for a day or two, before old patterns quietly creep back in the way they may have before. Meeting him with discernment does not mean withholding your own openness or making him prove himself through some kind of test. It means not confusing your relief that he finally showed up with certainty that the underlying situation has actually structurally changed. Give the actual pattern of his behavior time to prove itself, even while you allow your heart to respond honestly and openly to what's genuinely real and in front of you right now. The 12th and final card in the position of where this is genuinely heading is the Sun. And I want to be honest with you that I don't pull this particular card lightly in a reading like this one, especially not after everything we've just walked through together. The Sun is one of the most positive cards in the entire deck, representing clarity, warmth, and something finally coming into the light after a long stretch spent in shadow and confusion. What I'm sensing is that this situation, after the reckoning he's currently moving through, has real, genuine potential to move towards something more honest and more sustaining than what you've had access to before now, on the specific condition that what breaks through in him this week is not allowed to quietly recede back into old habits the way smaller moments of near honesty may have receded in the past. The potential here is real. I want to be clear that it is not automatically guaranteed simply by existing as a possibility. It becomes real, concrete, lasting through what both of you actually do with it once the initial intensity of this morning settles into something either of you can genuinely build from together, rather than something that gets felt intensely once and then filed away again. I want to describe what that sustained version actually looks like, because I think it's easy to picture one dramatic conversation and assume that's the whole resolution. It usually isn't. What tends to follow a reckoning like this one, when it's genuine, is not a single perfect exchange that solves everything permanently. It's a series of smaller moments where he has the chance to fall back into the old pattern, and more often than not, chooses not to. A moment where he could deflect and instead says the honest thing. A moment where distance would be easier and he stays present instead. It's in the accumulation of those smaller, truthful choices, not in one grand gesture, that you'll be able to tell whether what happened this morning was a genuine turning point or a temporary crack that eventually sealed itself back over. Watch for the pattern over the pattern's opposite. That's where the real answer will show itself. Before I bring this reading to a close, I want to pull one more card, a 13th, sitting slightly outside the main spread, in the position of what this entire experience is here to teach you, specifically you, independent of whatever he ultimately does with his own reckoning. The card here is the Hermit, a figure standing alone on a mountainside, holding a single lantern, a card about the wisdom that only comes from stepping back from a situation and examining it in solitude, rather than staying caught inside the noise of it. What I sense this whole experience has been quietly teaching you, underneath all the confusion and the waiting and the mixed signals, is something about your own worth that has nothing to do with whether he ever gets brave enough to show up the way you deserve. For some of you, this has been a lesson in learning to trust your own perception again, after a long stretch of being told, directly or indirectly, that you were reading too much into things. For others, this has been a slower, harder lesson about what you're actually willing to accept in a connection going forward, regardless of how this particular story with him resolves. I don't think this experience happened to you by accident, even the difficult parts of it, even the parts that hurt. Something in you is being asked to come out of this clearer about your own value than you went into it, and that clarity is yours to keep, no matter what he ultimately decides to do with his own feelings. I want to say one more thing before we move to the summary because I think it matters. Regardless of what happens with him, whether he reaches toward you in the way this reading suggests, or whether, for reasons of his own, he continues to struggle against his own fear longer than any of us would want for him, the insight you're walking away with today is yours. You now understand something true about how he experiences this connection that you didn't fully understand an hour ago. That understanding does not obligate you to wait indefinitely, and it does not obligate you to forgive anything before you're ready to. It simply gives you a more accurate map than the one you were working from before. And an accurate map is always worth more than a comfortable illusion, even when the truth inside it is complicated. So here is what I want you to carry with you out of this reading. And I want you to actually let it settle, rather than immediately reaching for your phone the second this ends. He is shaking today because of you, and that is not a small thing. And it is not something you imagined or manufactured out of hope or wishful thinking. Something in him broke open this morning, and what's underneath it is feeling that has been genuinely real for far longer than his behavior has ever let you see clearly. The tragedy in this situation was never that he didn't care about you. It was that fear taught him, a long time before you ever met him, that showing how much he cared was dangerous. And he has been quietly paying the cost of that early lesson in small pieces for as long as you've known him. And now, the accumulated weight of all those small pieces has finally become too large for him to keep carrying quietly. What comes next is not fully written yet, for either of you. His part of it is genuinely his to walk through, in his own time, in his own way. Your part is yours, and it starts with trusting what you've sensed all along, even when the surface evidence didn't confirm it. And it continues with deciding, from a grounded and steady place, rather than a desperate or relieved one, what you actually need going forward, regardless of exactly what he offers, or exactly when he offers it. If any part of this reading landed for you today, I genuinely want to hear it. Tell me in the comments where you are in this story right now, whether this feels like something that already started quietly moving in your own situation, or something you're still sitting and waiting on. Because I know so many of you watching are living inside some version of exactly this, loving someone who feels far more than they've ever shown. And there is real comfort in knowing you are not the only one holding that particular kind of quiet on your own. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with one last thought, separate from everything about him. Whatever happens next in the story, whether it unfolds exactly the way these cards are suggesting, or takes a shape none of us could have predicted from here, you are allowed to keep choosing yourself through all of it. Choosing yourself doesn't mean closing your heart off from what might genuinely be coming. It means staying rooted in your own sense of worth, while you watch to see whether his actions eventually catch up to what his body has apparently already been telling him all morning. You don't have to shrink your own needs to make room for his healing process. Both of you get to be human in this. Both of you get to be a little bit late to your own honesty sometimes. What matters most from here is not perfection from either of you, It's whether the direction going forward is actually toward truth instead of away from it. If this reading meant something to you, stay close to this channel because this story is not finished, and I will be back with more as it continues to unfold in the days ahead. For now, just take a breath, a full one, all the way in and all the way back out. What you've sensed this entire time was real. Trust it.